In political science and historiography, revisionism is the critical re-examination of historical facts we take for granted or considered settled. At its core, a revisionist's view challenges the orthodox or the standard. It looks at the narrative or an event by introducing new evidence or interpreting existing data through a different lens.
Reading through the comments on many of the things that the ANC do, I see a lot of people referring to South Africa of today under the current ANC regime as reverse apartheid or apartheid 2.0 or something of that sort. Now, this is profoundly incorrect to refer to South Africa's current regime as some form of apartheid, as apartheid was implemented by the National Party in South Africa from 1948 until 1992. What we are seeing here today is actually the exact opposite of reverse apartheid, in the sense that within apartheid, what was essentially the idea or the overarching idea of this was so-called separate development, and this was a group of policies that were implemented to develop different ethnic nations separately. That was the crux of apartheid. Now, the current regime wants to do the exact the exact opposite, in the sense that if you can describe apartheid as, in essence, forced segregation, what the current government is doing is forced integration. And this is much more damaging to the economy of South Africa than apartheid ever could be. And it's also, in some senses, much more damaging to the peoples who are targeted by the race laws against them in the current regime in South Africa.
Revisionism isn't necessarily a bad word. In fact, it is a standard part of academic or of the thinking process. It usually occurs due to new evidence, the discovery of classified documents, private letters, or archaeological finds. For example, the opening of Soviet archives after 1991. It can also happen because of shifting perspectives, such as changes to social values that lead historians to ask new questions, for example, looking at the apartheid regime. And it can also occur because of new methodologies, using modern data science, forensics, or linguistics to analyze old events.
Over the last couple of days, I've been reading the most important laws within the apartheid regime in depth, and I've been studying the laws word for word, as well as the actual source documents of the commissions and the reports that were done by the National Party government on the specifics of the specific logistics of the policies being implemented by them, because what we are taught in school and even at university about what apartheid is completely different from the reality that's actually written into the law books of apartheid. And I'll be sharing this with you in this video. I think this is an extremely important message and something that's extremely important to understand, especially if we take this debate forward when we talk about the gross human rights abuses that are being committed by the ANC currently in South Africa. And comparing this to apartheid is fundamentally flawed.
So let's do a comparison. It's important to distinguish between reasonable revisionism and historical negationism, also called denialism. So reasonable revisionism, the goal would be to improve the accuracy of history. A historical denier, their goal would be to promote a political or ideological agenda. A reasonable reviser would use peer-reviewed verified data. A denialist would do things like relying on forged documents or using proper documents but using their own interpretations, rely on hearsay, and often ignores other relevant evidence and focuses on the sort of evidence that helps their goal, their argument. The method of a reasonable reviser would be someone who's open to debate and further correction, and even changing their mind. A denialist, on the other hand, often involves biased motivations, unfounded conspiracy theories, and makes a lot of claims that are meant to hide the truth. Here's an example of reasonable historical revisionism. The Crusades. The Orthodox view on the Crusades is that they were about Christians starting and trying to fight Muslims, when in fact, when you look at history and you actually go through what happened, the sequence of events, you find that it's far more complex than that. That actually what you will find is that the Christians were merely defending themselves as a response to Muslim attacks and incursions into Christian lands. Now, when you look at something that might be a little bit more unreasonable as a reviser and straying onto the denialism side, is what I call the "we didn't know" accusation. This is usually the narrative pushed by many white people in South Africa about how they didn't know about apartheid because it was all hidden from them by the government. And if they did know, perhaps they would have done something differently. If you believe that, you'll believe anything. We see revisionism and historical revisionism in politics a lot, actually. In a political context, the term is often used as an epithet. For example, within Marxist theory, revisionism was used as an insult to describe those who wanted to achieve socialism through democratic reform rather than violent revolution. In international relations, a revisionist state, like a rising power, is one that seeks to change the current international system and power balance as opposed to the status quo. To have a revisionist view is to actually say, the way that we've been told this story is incomplete or incorrect, and based on this new information or this new way of seeing it or understanding it, we need to change our actual understanding of it and of what happened. There has emerged in the last few years in South Africa a shift to revise, to redefine, and to try and reframe what apartheid really was. This is coming mainly from factions of the white population in our country. One can only speculate on their motivations for doing this. However, simply put, it seems like a mixture of being fed up with called the bad guys who did an evil thing, mixed with a feeling of having to take care of themselves and take their own side, meaning to defend their own race. Add to that rejection of black rule and the corrupt ANC. It is basically an attempt to wrestle back some power towards themselves and towards their race. Some would conclude for the goal of separating from the blacks altogether. Perhaps, who can say? The most effective proponent of apartheid revisionism in South Africa today, in my opinion, is a man called Willem Petzer, who I like and have been watching for years now. He makes some very interesting and compelling content. He creates some good videos that focuses on issues concerning Afrikaners, farmers, and whites in general, which is his right. There's nothing wrong with loving your own people, and that's part of what I like about Mr. Willem Petzer. He also refers to himself as a Christian as far as his faith goes, making useful and helpful videos on Afrikaner history, politics, South Africa, farm murders, and more. In recent years, he has taken to revisionism. First on his Afrikaans language channel, now he's bringing it to his English channel, with Gareth Cliff even showing some interest and interviewing him exactly on this topic. I like Willem, and I like many of his videos, whether I agree with everything he says or not. That is why this shift towards apartheid revisionism is even more sloppy coming from him.
What do you mean by that?
Because he is bright and he calls himself a Christian. Apartheid revisionism is both sad and evil. It is an emotionally driven approach, masking itself behind misaligned facts, reinterpreting fact, and calling evil good and good evil. Apart from its inherent wrongness, something it has in common with apartheid is that it succeeds in proving the ANC and the EFF right when they say that the whites hate you because you are black and they miss apartheid. It gives some credence to that. What I'm saying is that apartheid revisionism is a big mistake. It's actually quite sad. I like Willem, and I understand he's trying to stand up for his people. However, in trying to stand up for his people, he has made a mistake, an old mistake of when you stand up for your own people, especially as a Christian, you must be very aware that you don't cross the line in hating other people just because you're standing up for your own. This is how even reasonable, intelligent, and mighty men like Willem Petzer fall. Apartheid revision like many other types of revision, wants to set the record straight on something that was never straight to begin with. It's a lost cause. It's a fundamentally lost cause. It causes otherwise reasonable people to try and justify unreasonable things with petty reinterpretations and biased reframing or rewording of history, not to mention leaving out what does not suit their goals or narrative. I've always said that those who still stand or seek to revise apartheid and would even try to say that it was not that bad need only to imagine the opposite. What if the black people were in the position of the whites and the NP and all the whites were in the position of the blacks, the coloreds, and the Indians? They took that position during apartheid. If that was the system and whites had all those laws of apartheid forced on them, they were sent to Robben Island. They were called kitchen girls and garden boys, beaten at will, falsely arrested, pushed out of their homes and forced to live somewhere else. They didn't have the full franchise in the vote, and they didn't have other rights as well, and they were limited in various different ways because of their skin color. If that was the system, would apartheid be all right then? If everything was just swapped around like that, and the whites were in the positions the blacks, the coloreds, and the Indians were, and the blacks, coloreds, and Indians were in the position the whites were during apartheid, would it be a crime against humanity then? When you ask a question like that, you usually get 4 types of answers, especially from white South Africans. Answer number 1 is an honest person who sort of just sees it and understands what you're saying and sort of gets the picture and says nothing and just sort of nods and says okay and continues to contemplate on the idea, but they get it, they see it immediately. Then you get the second type of answer. This is the dumbest answer. What this sort of person usually does is they try to equivocate and say, well, that is what is happening now. It's just apartheid in reverse. What the ANC is doing now is apartheid in reverse. That's what the second type of person tries to say. This is the dumbest. That person needs a library card and knows nothing about history or apartheid in particular. They need to read a book. It's difficult to even continue the discussion with them. The third type of person gives an answer that's sort of something like this. It's sort of the common answer for someone who really doesn't actually like black people at all.
What do you mean by that?
They usually say, well, we would never let something like that happen to us as white people. Unfortunately, that person is also ignorant because part of the Huguenots settling in Africa was because they were being persecuted and discriminated against. They had to actually flee and separate. Not to mention the Boers were discriminated against, even here in Africa, by the English. It started a whole war. Maybe you've heard about it. It used to be called the Anglo-Boer War, but it turns out there were a lot of people fighting on both sides of that war as well. And it's now called the South African War because black people were fighting on both sides, and the war culminated in inhumane treatment of the Boers by the English, in burning of their land, dispossessing them of their land, and then holding the Boers in concentration camps. Some have even said that's where the Nazis got their inspiration for their concentration camps, where they kept the Jews in World War II from these British concentration camps that were run here during the South African War. It's probably more accurate to say that they got it from when the Germans held Namibians in concentration camps, but it's actually not far from the truth as well. There were also about as many black people in concentration camps as well after that war. History tells us they were probably held in separate concentration camps. Ernst Roots, formerly of AfriForum, was one of the people you would actually hear being honest and making that statement from time to time. The fourth answer you get, when you ask the question, what if apartheid was flipped around? And this is the worst response, the worst and most evil response, that of apartheid revisionism, because it is not out of ignorance or blind racism or carelessness. It is willful, done with a full knowledge of what you are doing, and it is corruptly motivated. What an apartheid revisionist is actually trying to do when they answer this question or try to argue for a view of revising apartheid is that it comes from a place of twisting the evils and bad done to others to soothe one's own conscience and ego while pushing for separatist goals.
Emotional, damn it!
Take my original question of what if the role of the blacks and the whites in apartheid were flipped around?
As I said in the description of this video, if apartheid were taken exactly this as it was and reversed, in other words, every single law that was implemented during apartheid were to be implemented again, but whenever it was targeted at black people, it would have been targeted at white people, and you took it exactly the same word for word, not only would have the South African economy been in a better place, but Afrikaners and white people in general that are currently the persecuted minorities in South Africa would have also been in a massively better place.
What do you mean by that?
When we start talking about apartheid as a whole, the most important part of apartheid and also the most influential policy within apartheid was the creation of the so-called homelands or Bantustans for black South Africans. The government classified black South Africans as citizens of their respective ethnic homelands rather than South African citizens. Now, what this means was that even before these Bantustans were fully recognized as independent and sovereign, like some of them were during the end of apartheid, black South Africans were considered citizens of their respective ethnic homelands. And in essence, the biggest thing that's important in this sense were that these people did not have to pay taxes in South Africa unless they worked in South Africa. If they were productive within these homelands, they had zero obligation to pay any taxes to the South African government during apartheid. If the current government were to implement policies like these and create a separate homeland for Afrikaners, it would have been massively beneficial to Afrikaners in South Africa, as they then did not have to pay taxes to the South African government, just like what happened during apartheid, if they were productive within their homeland.
You see what apartheid revisionist Willem Petzer says about it. According to Mr. Petzer, the Boers, or whites in general, if you had split them up and applied the sort of Bantustan homeland system and split them off from the blacks, in my thought experiment of flipping the races around in apartheid, the blacks would be in charge if they were the government and they split off the whites into homelands. What Willem Petzer says, the whites in general and the Boers more particularly would have just proceeded to build a great folk in those homelands. He's sort of alluding to the fact that the blacks didn't, right? Now, I can see why some people would emotionally, just listening to that on the surface, why some people would just emotionally believe that, because that is something Boers have done, right? They've gone to a place and have built. Much of South Africa was built by them, right? So I can see why you would believe that. However, there's just a little problem. When it comes to this idea of apartheid being flipped around, you must understand those white people in those homelands would be living under apartheid laws. They wouldn't just be split off and free to do as they want. I think Mr. Petzer leaves out a few things, don't you think? Especially when you consider those people would be living under apartheid. This would not be let the Boers go because they lost the war and surrendered the fight. If things were flipped around and the Boers and the whites in general were under the same condition blacks were under apartheid in the homelands, you should not leave out the actual apartheid part, Mr. Petzer, such as
Over the following centuries, Black Africans were segregated onto so-called native reserves. And by the 20th century, that meant 70% of the population was living on roughly 13% of the country's land. Deprived of their traditional livelihoods and seeking to escape these overpopulated regions, Black Africans began migrating to white-controlled areas. There, they worked for low wages on white-owned farms and mines, alongside the descendants of enslaved and indentured workers from across Africa and Asia. By 1948, this exploited labor force was a primary driver of South Africa's booming economy. But economists argued that continued growth required a stable, educated, and urbanized African labor force. The ruling United Party accepted this logic, but the rival National Party argued such a workforce would threaten the white ruling class, naming their campaign Apartheid, the Afrikaans word for separateness. The National Party won the 1948 elections. And once in power, they began forcibly relocating millions of Africans back to the reserves. Under apartheid, Black workers were considered temporary visitors in white areas. They were restricted to specific zones, and their trade unions received no official recognition.
Living in a homeland was a controlled system, ruled from Pretoria, as to how you could develop and how far self-rule could go. Where do you think people like Bantu Holomisa gets his fame from? It is not because he's a firecracker of a politician. You've seen the man talk and be interviewed. He's not actually that convincing, and he hasn't gained much prominence as a politician for that fact. But he's still one of the most respected Black politicians in this country. Why is that? If you crack open a book, it's because he tried to perform a coup and tried to really self-rule, because homelands couldn't actually rule themselves.
December 30, 1987, the Transkei coup d'etat was a bloodless military takeover in the unrecognized South African homeland of Transkei, led by 32-year-old Major General Bantu Holomisa, chief of the Transkei Defence Force. The coup ousted Prime Minister Stella Sinkao's government. Holomisa suspended the civilian constitution, resisting South Africa's push for civilian rule, arguing that such a government would be a puppet controlled by Pretoria. Despite a failed counter-coup in 1990, Holomisa's military government remained in power until Transkei was reunited with South Africa in 1994 following the first democratic elections. A military rule medal was introduced to commemorate the coup, though its official details remain unclear.
Of course, he was outpowered and really outgunned and had to just hold in that position from 1987. And remember, that coup only happened in 1987, already on the brink of apartheid. Before then, things were much tighter, and he wouldn't have actually gotten away with it even 10 years before that. And the reason why the Black population of South Africa had to turn to asymmetrical warfare and the struggle movement itself is because in homelands, you couldn't just build, you couldn't just rule yourself like Bantu Holomisa tried to do. He had to try and do a coup against Pretoria to do it. Can you see that the homeland is not independent? It's not some independent state that can just build by itself. And he was not allowed to just rule himself, because then he would have his own ideas and build his own things, just like Mr. Petzer imagines the Boers would be able to do if apartheid were flipped around. But you wouldn't, because Pretoria would then crack down on you.
And now we were a little bit worried about South Africa as well, as to what must we do.
The members of the new military council who are running the country are responsible people. They are loyal to Transkei, and they are also friends of South Africa.
Just like they did on Bantu Holomisa, and he was only able to hold out because he did it in 87, and that was already the dusk on apartheid. Apartheid was basically was coming to an end. Mr. Petzer mustn't also forget that if the whites were put into homelands, the homelands weren't independent states. They were labor settlements, and the townships was the labor compound. You came from the labor settlement to the labor compound to the job in town, and then back to the compound, and during the holidays like Easter, back to the homeland, which is the labor settlement. That was the actual system. It was actually very diabolical, very clever in the evilest way.
If we look at the specific laws of the Bantustans, we can look at, for example, the Bantu Authorities Act of 1951, which established a local authority to govern every single one of these black homelands as a sovereign nation, even within a nation. And also there was the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959, which divided black South Africans into ethnic groups and assigned them to their respective homelands, giving them citizenship within whatever homeland corresponded with their ethnicity. And then finally there was the Black Homelands Citizenship Act of 1970, which took away the citizenship in South Africa of black people within the homelands and made them only have citizenship within their respective homelands.
The homelands were places where raw materials were extracted and shipped from the homelands into the major business centers. Soldiers patrolled homelands, even the mine dumps. People who grew up in apartheid would testify to that, both on the white side and on the side of the blacks. They would break up weddings. They would stop your car at will. They would beat people. It's not just a place where you can have an independent state and build. It's not like that. It's a labor settlement. You have restricted freedoms. So who would you trade with? How would you build? You're not a free state, to borrow a phrase. You are a limited entity of Pretoria.
Now, if we look at the development of the homelands, a very interesting report that I had read very recently was the Tomlinson Commission report of 1954. In 1950, the South African government established the Tomlinson Commission to assess the economic viability of homeland as well as the government expenditure on these homelands within the apartheid era. The commission then took 5 years to compile this report, and the report was then released in 1954, which is exactly 5 years after the Bantustan's policies were implemented at first. And what the Tomlinson report found was that there was much more significant state investment to develop these areas than what was originally thought within the Homelands Plan. The total investment within these homelands, according to the Tomlinson Commission, was £104 million. Now remember, this was £104 million between 1950 and 1954. This means that if you take the inflation calculator today, you would see that it is roughly 3.5 billion pounds today, which translates to almost 100 million rands in today's money. So 100 billion rands in today's money.
Okay.
So 100 billion rands had been spent on developing these homelands, and the report further classified the expenses within the Bantustans as agricultural development that got about 54 billion rands in today's money. Remember, I'm reading in today's money right now. Soil reclamation of about 27 billion. Credit facilities, that's like giving people within homelands loans in order to develop themselves, which was about 3 billion rands. Irrigation systems of also 3 billion rands. Forestry developments of also 3 billion. Then manufacturing and tertiary education, also 30 billion rands in today's money. Urban development, 12 billion rands. Transport and other basic facilities, 13 million rand. Health services and hospitals, 5 billion rand. Education, 23 billion rand. Welfare services, 3.6 billion rands in today's money. Now, just imagine that the current ANC government would, in this fantasy of an actual reverse to apartheid, give white people their own homeland. It doesn't matter where it is. It could be in the middle of the desert like Orania. It could even be the historic Afrikaner cities like Pretoria. Does not matter at all where it is. But then they spend roughly 100 billion rands in developing this homeland for Afrikaners that came from state funds, and they gave Afrikaners citizenship within their own sovereign country and give them this opportunity to only pay taxes to their own homeland and not to the South African government.
Factories were often restricted from being set up there, especially by black people. That's why Herman Mashaba always has a soft spot in South African history, especially among black people, even though he's made a lot of missteps as a politician. Because this man used to be a folk hero, whether people knew his face or not, because he had done something that many black people couldn't do. He had set up his own factories. And it wasn't for lack of trying by other people. It was because they were restricted and couldn't do the trade and couldn't even get the thing built. But he eventually did, and that was only in the 80s though, in the sunset of apartheid. You also then have to consider the labor, which was tightly controlled and funneled strategically into the major centers of economy, with families being broken apart strategically by apartheid, which disables the building of a society. If you fragment the family, you fragment that society. The ANC is using the same strategy today, but with social grants, because people can live wherever they want now. But you still want to fragment them to make them weak. You do it with social grants. What the apartheid government did was to put people far away from their jobs and extract the man. You have to manage the development of the homeland. The homeland didn't manage itself. You couldn't just build. That's why if you say if the whites were separated into a homeland, they could have just created this oasis. Many people wanted to do that in the black tribes, in the kingdoms, and politicians like Bantu Holomisa, because you were not a free state. You were a managed territory, and your development was managed. And that was the point of the homeland, by the fascist apartheid regime, to keep the peace, by keeping the natives just happy enough. Even that didn't work because apartheid was fundamentally a flawed and evil idea. It is just not how humans function. The homelands were territories. They were not independent. They functioned as territories of a broad fascist apartheid state. They were controlled from Pretoria, with their leaders being the equivalent of what today would be an MEC or at best a premier. Premiers and MECs of today have much more powers with the broader government in Pretoria than any of the homeland leaders ever did during apartheid. Most of their powers were vested in the Bantustans themselves, and any communications and power they had with Pretoria was well managed by Pretoria themselves. Under the supervision of Pretoria, you couldn't just build. That completely negates and misunderstands what apartheid was. They could not just build themselves up. They were managed for maximum labor production goals. They weren't a free vassal state that could just build themselves. 100 billion was invested in the homelands, as Willem Petzer points out. What was that for? Was that for the development of the homeland? 80% of the population. What do you think that money was put into the homelands for? So they could build themselves up? That is a fundamental reframing of what apartheid is, and is just dishonest. This was not for the benefit of the homeland. The Bantustan was a labor settlement, and you had to keep the peace there. It had the added value of keeping the blacks all the way over there, away from the white areas. That money was for keeping away the revolt, pacifying the mass, and managing the population while extracting resources and labor from those areas. The black ruling elite in the homelands were acting on behalf of the apartheid regime and were appointed by or with the permission of the regime itself. The leaders in the homelands were not about building the place up, they were executing the government's goals. Why do you think the IFP actually fought on the side of F.V. de Klerk in the early 90s? Because the IFP and some of the leaders in the Zulu homeland and in the Zulu royal family had close links with the apartheid government and were trying to hammer out a couple of deals, like the land that they got, the Ingwenyama Trust that they now own. Because these people were run by Pretoria. They couldn't just do what they wanted and oppose the government. That came at a cost. That's why the IFP decided to use that, not to just full on go against the government, but to fight on their side to extract something for themselves. And then it could benefit themselves just like it does today, instead of just benefiting Pretoria as it did during apartheid. You couldn't just build. If you leave out the actual apartheid of it, Willem, Anybody can believe it then. It sounds plausible, it sounds believable, but it's just revisionism.
I don't think you have the facilities for that, big man.
Think of Orania. Orania is not like a Bantustan or like a Homeland. To equate the two, it's a joke and it's not real. It's not like a Bantustan at all. They are actually free. In fact, they benefit from having a democratic country that sees them as a free place and allows them to do what they are doing. Black, coloreds, and Indians and others could not have ever built something like an Orania under apartheid. It would have been attacked by the military. It would have been broken down. It would have been illegal. It would have been destroyed by the fascists. And I call the apartheid regime fascists because by definition, that is what they were. It is not just an expression or some wokeism. You will find no wokeism on this channel. The apartheid regime meets the definition almost exactly as Mussolini defined it. Under apartheid, your language would have been actually relegated to second class, and all whites would have had to learn one of the older indigenous languages. I say older because I understand when Afrikaners say that Afrikaans is an indigenous African language. I have no problem with that. Under apartheid, though, speaking Afrikaans to your Sepedi-speaking boss in town or at a factory would have been a no-no, and you wouldn't have that job for very long. You can't leave the actual apartheid out of that thought experiment of switching things around, Mr. Petzer. I could go on about the true flipping around of apartheid that Willem Petzer conveniently leaves out, because I don't think he is ignorant enough to just leave those things out. He is revising. He is doing it on purpose. He leaves it out or reframes and reinterprets to suit his goals. For I have not even mentioned how economic growth was limited under apartheid for those people who weren't white. Bantu education was to keep the peace and create laborers to control the advancement of the black person, wanting them to be mostly laborers or have low-skilled jobs. Verwoerd said that himself. That's what the fascists wanted. The ANC wants them as grant beneficiaries. And that's the actual difference. The goal of the fascists was a labor force and a permanent semi-skilled underclass, while the goal of the socialist is a permanent underclass of social grant beneficiaries.
This would have actually killed the South African corruption base, where a lot of taxpayers' money is being stolen by corrupt ANC cadres or misused and mismanaged by incompetence, because the money that were being productive in the so-called fictional homeland of reverse apartheid would have ended up within an authority that would have, if we reversed some of these acts, in a authority that was consisted of Afrikaner people and also ruled by Afrikaner people, if we want to put it like that.
The family structure was broken. It was de-evolving. Taking fathers out of the home, especially in an agrarian life, is a sentence to poverty, basically.
Then also there was a lot of social and cultural segregation, like prohibition of mixed marriages in 1959, Immorality Amendment Act of 1950, which was basically the same thing, and then also Separate Indemnities Act. So in other words, different benches for different races of people. And this is actually the act within apartheid that is brought up the most by people who want to show you how their human rights were abused during apartheid. They would show you the so-called apartheid bench, which is like a bench that says blankes, slegs blankes, or Europeans only. And this is the biggest proof of this so-called dehumanization of black people, with the fact that they had to sit in different areas on the bus, on different benches in the park, and walk through different doors, etc., etc. Now another
race law strategically excluded black people from things apartheid did not want them in, from jobs, buildings, benches, to even sporting codes.
The Group Areas Act was also promulgated in 1950, which divided cities and towns into racial zones, which sometimes required the forced removal of people, and it wasn't just black people, it was white people also, from certain areas that were earmarked for different races. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but many white people actually didn't just lose their homes within the Group Areas Act, but also they lost their farms that were expropriated by the government to be given by the Bantustans, which we discussed earlier in this video. And these farms were obviously expropriated with compensation and then given to the Bantustans. But as for the Group Areas Act, both white people and non-white people that had to leave their homes didn't lose the title deed to their homes. For instance, there were a lot of colored people that owned homes in places like Sea Point, which was obviously part of the earmarked area for white people, but they still owned these homes and they were able to rent them out to the white people that stayed there. Of course, this wasn't always the case, because this was only the case when the people actually owned the property in which they stayed, card and transport. They had a title deed to that property. If they were just staying there and they didn't have any title deeds, they were obviously forcefully removed and then moved to another area of the city. Now, I can't see how, if this policy was reversed and let's say that there's another new Group Areas Act, I can't see how that would make much of a difference to how cities are being laid out today, because at the end of the day, it is already racially segregated, and poor people stay in poor areas and rich people stay in rich areas. So if you take the rich people out of the rich area, for instance, exactly like what happened during apartheid, and you tell them they have to move to another area, like for instance, you tell them they have to move from Constantia in Cape Town to Kraaifontein or whatever the case may be, and they would still own their property within Constantia, they would be able to rent it out or sell it off to a person that is actually allowed to stay there. So yes, it would be an inconvenience, but it's not as much of an inconvenience as might be construed from what happened here.
White people lost farms, Willem says. What he leaves out is that many of them also gained farms from someone else. Many chiefs and landowners were surprised to find out that their land was owned by someone else, out of the blue, a white someone else. The first time they would learn of this is when the white person came to them threatening with guns and government intervention. The white person now had a title deed newly minted from thin air by the government. If the landowner or chief refused, they were attacked by the government of the time, the Union of South Africa. This is the historical fact of South Africa. You don't need to revise it. It's just a fact. Why would you need to revise just the facts? These are the things the apartheid revisionist airbrushes and leaves out. If someone can mint a deed for your land without your permission, without ever consulting you, kick you out of your home, that's fascism. Forced removal is unjust, and that's where the Homelands even started from. Willem Petzer calls it an inconvenience.
So yes, it would be an inconvenience, but it's not as much of an inconvenience as might be construed from what happened here.
If you were forced out of your home, it was something that was just inconvenient. Are white people fighting or rejecting land redistribution and other land policy? Are they fighting that in South Africa today because it would just be inconvenient? Laws that the ANC and the EFF like to push. Are white people in South Africa, and actually most black people, but let's just stick to the white people for now. Are white people in South Africa against the sort of land laws that the ANC and the EFF push just because they would be inconvenient? Are they just against it because losing your farm or your house in whatever suburb you live in, because that's where that land law is going actually, would that just be an inconvenience to people? Would that just be something they would deem inconvenient? That's why they're against it. To be moved to wherever the government decides. If the ANC government decided today that they're taking land from white people in suburbs and on farms and move them wherever they wanted, just like the fascist National Party government did, would that just be an inconvenience to Willem Petzer and other people who are reframing apartheid? To be moved wherever, is that just an inconvenience? Willem, this sounds ridiculous. It sounds unfeeling, without mercy, without charity, the opposite of Christ. Apartheid revisionism is foolish. It's filled with lies, And you know what the saddest thing about it is? It's completely unnecessary.
Emotional, damn it!
Then we can get to other laws like the Pass Laws Act, which essentially is written exactly the same as a visa. So basically, a person that enters a different country needs a visa to enter that country. And as we know, because of the Bantustans, these people that were living there were seen as citizens of different countries, and therefore they require a visa to be in South Africa. And then this required black South Africans to carry passbooks at the time, which contained information about their employment and their residency and personal details, which is basically exactly the same as the information that you would have in your passport today and your visa. So whenever you get pulled over in a place like America and they ask who you are, where you're from, are you here legally, you can show them your passport and your visa, and then they would know exactly where you are from.
Willem Petzer says things like, pass laws is just like a visa. Well, it really isn't, is it? If you had to follow Willem's example, like a visa based on your color, not your citizenship, because actually your citizenship was stripped away when you were moved to a homeland. That's what the apartheid equivalent would be. If we flipped it and we said, okay, all white people into the homelands and black people, colored people, and Indian people live everywhere else, that government would actually have to strip away the citizenship rights of the whites, including the vote and other things. And then when you wanted to go anywhere in the country out of that homeland, because that was part of the homeland system, you had to present this pass and you were limited to certain times, also limiting not only your freedom, but how you can build as a person. So it wasn't just like a visa. A visa doesn't cause you to lose citizenship to anything, and it's not about your own country, it's about some other country. If you move to a homeland, you are a person of no country, because the homeland isn't even a country, it's a territory of the broader country where you don't have citizenship, actually. That's actual apartheid. That's what the equivalent would be. To equate pass laws to a visa is just not true. It is a visa based on color in your own country and restricts your freedoms in your own country. When Mr. Petzer and other revisionists downplay something like this, gives room to the socialists that can sell the idea that the whites want apartheid back. They love apartheid and they're defending it because they hate.
Now, this is profoundly incorrect to refer to South Africa's current regime as some form of apartheid, as apartheid was implemented by the National Party in South Africa from 1948 until 1992. What we are seeing here today is actually the exact opposite of reverse apartheid, in the sense that within apartheid, what was essentially the idea, or the overarching idea of this, was so-called separate development, and this was...
The apartheid revisionist also makes a big mistake when he reframes apartheid as a benevolent thing. They have a benevolent view of apartheid. This is a very detached way of thinking. It doesn't even think of the people affected by apartheid as human beings. It shows that you're so detached and you see them just as meat puppets. And you also have to lie to sort of have that sort of benevolent view of apartheid, and it's also ignorant of what apartheid was. You don't even see the other people as human, really. Therein lies the truth. And that's exactly the logical outcome of apartheid revisionism. Thank you for listening. If you dare, buy us a coffee. The link is in the description.
Hoya Rona,
So yes, it would be an inconvenience, but it's not as much of an inconvenience as might be construed from what happened here.